617, respond to report of shots fired.
The Coroner Talk podcast takes you behind the scenes with coroners, clinicians, and death investigators from around the world to provide training, news, and interviews from leading experts in the area of death investigation and scene management, bringing real stories and solid training together in one source. Now, here's your host, Darren Dake.
Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Coroner Talk. I am so glad that you joined me yet again. So we have a wonderful show for you today, a return guest that I believe it's been around 4 years since she has been on the show, Dr. Jan Canty. You may remember, if you're a longtime listener of the show or you recently went back and binged a lot of stuff, she was on the show a number of years ago talking about her husband being found dead and how she navigated those waters and the whole story behind his death and things, which she's going to tell you about again here in a moment. But this show, she's going to talk about that a little bit more, just kind of recap that. But we're also going to talk about her new book. Now, it isn't about selling her book. You'll find out throughout this show how inexpensive this book is and how easy it is to get into your hands. It's about the information in the book. So it is for you, and it's for survivors, and it is for you to help people that you deal with on a daily basis when it comes to death, especially in homicide or suicide. And so her book is What Now? Navigating the Aftermath of Homicide and Suicide. And it's multiple authors, multiple topics, and it is geared towards helping the survivor of a homicide or suicide case. And so here's the good part about this. Yes, it's a great book for somebody who is a survivor of that to have the book to read. You may loan it out, give it out, something like that, or people may buy it if they're a survivor. It is also a fantastic book for you as an investigator to read and look through the chapters and different topics, and so that you can be better prepared to help your survivors with some of their questions, like what do I do now in any number of topics, media or their own safety and different things like that. So as you know, with my other life, my coroner life, I'm the coroner of this county, and we have a survivor support group, and this book is now part of their team. So my team with the survivor support team reads this, and they have a better understanding of how to help people through some of their situations. So even if it's not necessarily homicide or suicide, there's a lot in this book that will help survivors of just about any death. Now, some chapters are more relevant than others, and this book isn't made to go necessarily from chapter 1 all the way through. You can pick the chapters that you want. And so she's going to tell you about that. It's amazing. So don't tune out because we're talking about a book. This isn't a sales commercial. This is a resource and how you can use this resource to help the survivors that you deal with. And, also if you can help your survivors to navigate the waters that they're dealing with, that it also makes them better witnesses and allows you to get the information you need if it's part of the investigation. You're not going to have a great witness. You're not going to have a great investigation when the person that the survivor is so, for lack of a better term, scatterbrained, stressed. They don't know which way to go in a lot of different ways and topics, and they feel scared. Calm them down, help them calm down. It just makes for a better investigation as well. So this book is a fantastic resource for every person involved in a death investigation, from the law enforcement through to coroner. And so just real quickly, before we get into that, please, I want you to remember the MDI course, our classroom course, is in October. It is moved to Springfield, Missouri. It's usually within our county outside of St. Louis. Well, we've outgrown that. We need a place that's going to be better beneficial for you financially and a kind of a one-stop shop place where you can be at the whole week. That has been moved to Springfield. It's at the Oasis Convention Center in Springfield. You can fly into the Springfield airport. There's a shuttle from the hotel to the airport, and so you don't have to rent a car if you don't want to. You can stay at that hotel, and the cost of the training has actually came down. So the cost of the training is $825. But what does that give you? It gives you 40 hours of classroom with 5 different instructors. It gives you 20 hours of additional online training and the option to set for the certification exam if you wish to. Plus, it provides breakfast and lunch every day for the 5 days that you're there in Springfield. So actually, the cost is less than it was at our old location. So you get all of that for the $825, 60 hours worth of training, plus a certification exam if you wish to, and, of course, shuttle to and from the airport, so you don't have to rent a car. So it's going to be a fantastic time. We had it in April there. That was our first time at this location, and now October of 2023, and we're looking forward to it being a fantastic time again. Lots of good training. Again, you get time to spend with instructors, and we have hospitality rooms where you're in one hotel. You don't have to do a lot of traveling, and so you got to do a lot of networking. Remember, we bring people in from all over the country, and so you get to do a lot of networking with people and can find a lot of opportunities. So remember that. And of course, on the website, we have a lot of online training things. I always want to mention that because training is our heart, and we want to get you all the training that we can. So without any further delay, let's get into this conversation that I have with Jan about What Now, navigating the aftermath of homicide and suicide.
Adjust your earbuds, turn up those speakers, and hang on. It's now time for this week's featured conversation.
All right, I'm back with you, and joining me through the power of the internet is Dr. Jan Canty. Jan, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you much for having me.
So we were talking pre-show, and I didn't look it up. I know that you were on the show many years ago, and lots have happened since then. And I think you were on the show the last time we were just talking about actually, your story, but that has been probably 4 years ago or more. And
right.
Of course, we're going to talk about this book that you have written, which is amazing. But it's not about the book. It's about what the book can provide and what the book does to our listeners. That's the key. It's not just an entertainment book. It's really, really something that's a tool as well. So if you don't care, take a second or take as much time as you need, really, to tell us about who you are, who's Jan, but then tell us about that horrible time in your life that actually shaped who you are today and actually what caused this book to be written.
Sure. Well, I'm a native Detroiter. I was born, raised, educated, and widowed there. I come from a very normal family, not much drama growing up, and I loved school and was not encouraged to go on to college, but wanted to do that. And in the process of going to college, met my future husband. I worked for him first as a secretary, and then we started dating and eventually married. I think it was a year and a half later. We were married 11 years. He was a psychologist. He was 18 years older. And one day he just did not come home. It was a very stormy day that day. Even though it was summer, it was a hailstorm and wind and heavy rain. And at first I dismissed his tardiness to that because he was very punctual. But to make a long story short, after 7 days of not returning, of course, it wasn't that. And I was called down to the Detroit police headquarters by a detective, Marlis Landeros, who's an amazing individual. Could do a whole story on just her. But at any rate, she called my parents and I down there. Me and I wanted my parents to come, and told us that, along with Inspector Gil Hill, that they had reason to believe that he had been murdered, but they did not yet have his body. This was back in 1985 when DNA, as you know, wasn't what it is today. So they had to wait to get more evidence, which they then got quite a bit of over the next week. So there came a day after that where they called me down to the morgue to identify him. And when I was on your show the last time, we went into, because of the work you do and because of who your listeners are, I felt more comfortable going into more detail about that process of identifying him, because he had been dismembered. He had been buried in a bog for over a week in northern Michigan, exhumed and brought back to Detroit. I don't think that today they would do that, as you would understand that better than me, but I don't think DNA today would require that in-person identification would be done that way, but it was. And I had to identify him by his head. And Detective Landeros was extremely supportive during that process. I don't remember if there were other people in the room. I was kind of foggy at that point, not just from the trauma of it, but the fatigue had really set in by that point. And so, that was a turning point in my life. And of course, what followed that in terms of the preliminary exam, the trial, the media, the financial fallout. I mean, it just went on and on. It was like every day, what's the trauma going to be? And how it links to where I am today is that whole experience was so pummeling on me. I don't know how else to describe. I felt like I was drowning every day and being pushed under the water. Every day it was some new thing. Like one day I was told by my physician I should be tested for AIDS because my deceased husband had been with an IV drug abusing prostitute. And this was back when the ELISA test was brand new. It had only been out 10 days, 14 days. And he told me that because it was imperfect, I should get retested every year for 7 years. So that was over my head. It was always something. And so to get away from it, eventually I moved. Reluctantly, I might add, but I moved because I was tired of the media. I was tired of the exposure. And so I did. And I went to a place where nobody knew me. And it's back in 1985. It was easier to do this than it is today. We didn't have electronic footprints. And I sat on idle for 3 decades. I didn't tell a soul. I couldn't reach out to anybody. There was nobody to reach out to, really. And the internet wasn't yet invented. But eventually, after 30 years, I did. And it kind of went from one extreme to the other, where then I would not talk about it, to now I'm trying to use the time I have left to be a strong advocate for other homicide survivors in many forms, because there is still so little in the way of resources.
That is true, and your book helps with that. If it's okay, I want to go back to your identification time for just a moment.
Sure.
A couple of things about this. Again, we've got a lot. It's been several years. We've got a lot of new listeners, and I want to just kind of make sure they understand where you're coming from here. Number one is you had to identify your husband by his head, not the rest. It wasn't the whole body, and of course he'd been dead. The rest of the body had been dead for a while. And I remember you talking about when you went down to the ME's office, what stuck in your mind, if I remember correctly, was like the steps, the dark, gray, cold feeling of the building. And I mean, the day alone, but just your feeling of going in there, knowing what you're going to have to do. And this detective was a fantastic help for you. But, that as a survivor, just describe briefly again, kind of what that felt like and what you were going through at that time. Because when we deal with the survivors, we think we know what they're going through, but if we've never experienced it, that's a whole different thing.
You're right. The building itself was built in the 1920s. It was built to resemble an Egyptian mausoleum. There's a lot of gray marble and concrete granite, very austere looking, small by today's standards, and it smelled horrible. This was in July of 85. As I understood it from our show, the ventilation has improved since then, but it was heavy feeling, closed in feeling, dark as I remember it. But remember also I was very, very tired. So I'm sure that colored my perception somewhat, but I felt like I was on automatic pilot. I felt like I'm almost out of body. I was numb. I was putty in their hands, literally. I mean, when the detectives asked me to do something, I did it to the best I could. I mean, I remember one point where they asked me, I'd been sitting on this bench, and they asked me to get up and follow them, and I couldn't do it. It wasn't that I wasn't willing, but I could not get momentum. It's like I had lead boots on. It felt very claustrophobic. I remembered an article in the newspaper that I had read years earlier that upstairs there was a display case. It was a marble staircase, and it showed it in the photograph in the newspaper. It was a display case that showed the implements of death over the years from suicide and homicide. And I'm thinking, I know that's upstairs, and this is just gruesome enough. Why do they have to have that? It just felt very impersonal, very official. Of course, it was official, but very dark, and like time stood still. I could not tell you if I was there 5 minutes or an hour. I have no sense of time. The distances were also bizarre. and given now what I see is the size of the building, which has been torn down since then. It was a very small building because it was built in the 1920s when Detroit wasn't what it is today in population. But as I remember it, the hallways are very, very long, and they couldn't have been because it was a small building. So your perceptions are distorted.
Yeah.
And at least in my experience, I was just trusting that the people around me knew what to do because I did not know where to go. I did not know what they wanted me to do. I did not know what to say. I didn't have any idea what the procedures would be, how awful it would be. And so it was a really unique, odd experience, one I've never, of course, encountered since.
Right, right. And just briefly about your husband, and of course, you already alluded that he'd been having an affair with an IV drug user, but there was more to that. Like so in 85, maybe it's a little bit different, but if I remember correctly, it isn't that you and your husband were poor. He made good money. I don't know if you, at that time, if you were a doctor yet, but
No.
but he made good money and he had a good practice, and you guys were not, necessarily living a lifestyle that would be of wanting maybe, but he had a totally different lifestyle. Like he was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, so to speak, in his lifestyles. He had a house, he had the job. And for some reason, as good as all that was, a beautiful house, a job, a beautiful wife, money, he lived a different life. So tell us a little bit about the life he lived and kind of what that was like, which led to his death. And then do you know why? I mean, do you know why he lived that life?
Yes, he did have two faces. We were comfortable. We lived in a big house that he really wanted. I could have cared less. I was commuting to school, but it's like, that's what he wanted. Okay. And he had this other identity that he had forged at least for 18 months prior to his death, where he went by the name Dr. Miller. He passed himself off as a physician. He hung out in the Cass Corridor, which is the red light district of Detroit, where there's not only a lot of prostitution going on, but a lot of drug sales, a lot of weapons sales. It's changed since then, but this was back in the day when there were over 800 murders a year. Not all in that right immediate vicinity, but Detroit was a busy place in terms of the morgue and detectives, etc. And he chose to go down there repeatedly. He chose to, quote, date, I guess is the term they use, this sex worker, supply her lifestyle with drugs, cars, money, paid her rent, and befriended her pimp, John Carl Fry. And he seemed to want the trade-off for him, and I'll go more into detail later about what I think caused all this, but a superficial explanation would be that the trade-off was that he exchanged their company for a guaranteed audience. He wanted to pontificate about the history of Detroit and all of his cases and brag, and they needed the money, so they were willing to sit and listen to him. And they did this over 18 months until he ran out of money. And when he ran out of money, of course, the glamour was gone. There was no point for them to put up with him any longer. And he went back to their house the evening that he did not come home. It was a terrible rainy day that day. And there was an eviction notice on the house. Goodness knows what they've been doing with the rent money, but there was an eviction notice on the house. So their tension was up. They were high. They walked in. He went there knowing he was broke, knowing he did not have more money to give them. And he got into an argument with John Carl Fry. Now, John Carl Fry is not a guy you want to get in an argument with. He looked like a disheveled Mr. Clean, a big, bald-headed guy with muscles and tattoos, a biker by history. And at least a third bigger than my husband. My husband was not a big man. And they got into an argument over money. And my husband made the mistake of pushing him in the argument. And he stumped, not hard, but enough where he got him off balance, and he's tripped. John Carl Fry tripped over a low stool that was behind him, and fell backwards, which infuriated him. And he picked up a Louisville Slugger and beat him to death. After he beat him to death, he dragged him to the bathtub where he dismembered him. And from there, he and Dawn Marie Spence, his accomplice, packaged his remains, refrigerated them for a bit, and then drove them north to Petoskey, where they were buried. As to why I think he did this, there's a whole chapter in my first book on this, so it's a complicated answer. But if I were to try to encapsulate it, I would say this, that for a person to live a double life as an adult, they had to have been forced to live one as a child. And he did, not to the extreme of this. But his family had all the appearances. Sometimes in psychology, they're called a window display family, because from the front side, it looks perfect. Everything's strategically placed. The pins are where they need to be, the lighting, etc. But if you go around back, you can see that it's stitched together. Because on the front side of it, his mother was the president of the PTA. She was on the school board at the Wayne State University. His father was a quote psychologist. He really wasn't licensed. Back in that day, it was only certification, and he did not have a doctorate. But he worked with the Detroit police, and he would like to rail about his cases at home in graphic detail. One of the things that was inconsistent in his upbringing is that he berated my husband consistently, verbally. To my knowledge, there was never any physical abuse, though there might have been. I don't know that. But there was certainly a lot of verbal abuse, undermining him, ridiculing him, expecting him to cower, at the same time expecting him to excel academically. So this puts any child in a situation where they have a public face and a private face. Behind the scenes, he was troubled. He was never feel like he measured up. He had a lousy self-esteem, wanted to please his father, who was not a person that you could please, and publicly to display pride in his family name and his parents in particular. So he was kind of reared with the demand that he make something of himself, and he did, but with the unwritten message that you're not real, you're a phony, you don't measure up, you're faking it. And so I think in his mind, the way he turned out was his compromise. He had both. He was sabotaging himself, while on the outside it looked successful. And I saw only the successful. I did not know that this whole other sabotaging side to him even existed.
And that's interesting because, you hear you say that, and there are others who will say similar things about their experiences. I did not know. I didn't see. Maybe there's some hindsight, some 20/20 hindsight, but in many cases there's not. And I didn't know this person lived a double life, or I never did see it, and some people are that good at just hiding that second lifestyle.
True enough.
Yeah. And of course, you as a psychologist would know more than I, but yes, it's I've worked death investigations where, not to maybe to the extent of your husband, but certainly the death has been caused from some other activity where the wife had no idea that this other lifestyle was going on. And in a couple of cases come to mind. One was the man had a homosexual relationship and his partner killed him. And then another one, he just had a lot of girlfriends and a lot of things. And his wife, both of those wives had no idea that their husband was like that. He was perfect at home, perfect at church, perfect at work. And he was just a different person outside of that.
And that's how he had to perform as a child. He had to be perfect in school. He had to be perfect when he was a student and to his parents' friends. So he got really good. In fact, one of his father's interests was acting. They were in community theater, which I think is interesting because that certainly feeds it. But they're so good at it. Keep in mind that they can pass the lie detector tests because they don't register anxiety. They're so compartmentalized in the way that they live that it becomes second nature. And I will add this, that to a small degree, I can relate because of the fact that for 30 years, no one knew about my past. I didn't speak about it to anybody. And you get in such a habit of not bringing it up and choosing your words and being careful not to leave questions that could pry loose the history that you don't want people to know. The difference is I got concerned about it. It created anxiety in me. I got to a point where I found it impossible to keep them separate. It was just too much pressure on me. I had to watch my words, even like when I went to, because I didn't want anybody to know. I didn't want to talk about it. Like even when I went to see a physician, if I changed doctors, you have that form you fill out when you're brand new. And it said on there, have you ever been married before? And I would think about it. What do I say here? I mean, it was like everywhere I turned, it seemed like I had to guard I couldn't be spontaneous. I couldn't take it after a while. And finally, I'm glad I didn't, because it led to what I'm doing today.
Right. And so I'm going to ask one more question. We'll talk about how this book helps. And if you don't want to answer this, then obviously so you don't answer it. There's two parts. One, have you been married since? And B, how did that conversation go? And, what's the insight into that? So you have been, I've seen you shake your head. So you have been married since then.
Yes.
And
17 years.
So, to start that process, and we don't have to go very deep into this, but here you are a survivor of a brutal murder of a husband. Not just the fact that he lived two lives. That's one thing about it, which is probably the biggest thing. But then also you've got a murdered husband. Well, now you've got to learn to love and trust and all this. But then you have to tell this potential husband, the person you're dating, is like, oh, and by the way, I was married again, and he was dismembered and thrown into a swamp. How does that come up, and how did he take that?
It came up little by little, and he had to pull it out of me. When you start to date, naturally you're going to say, have you ever been married before, or how long? And most people assumed that if I said I would been married before, that I'd been divorced, and I didn't correct him. He, on the other hand, said, were you divorced or did he die? And I'm like, ooh, that's closer to the truth. And I said, he passed away. And he said, how did he die? And I said, I don't want to talk about it yet, but I will eventually. Yes. And so later he brought it up, and I just said, he didn't die naturally. He did not die of an illness. But I'll tell you more later. I mean, it's not that I was stringing him along. It's like, it's very exhausting to bring it up. And it's very, I did not want to be pitied.
Right.
And he is a very patient man. So I'd say we were dating, maybe it was our 5th, 6th, 7th date, when I finally said, here's the brief rendition. And I told him the bare facts, and he's a very calm guy. Yeah. He's a military. He's a colonel. He's not retired, but colonel in the Army. He was an airborne ranger. Nice. So he's very steady, very big guy. Yeah. Listened very patiently. And he said, well, that answers my question. And he said, I'm not going to bring it up, but if you want to tell me more, that's fine.
Yeah. That's appropriate.
And we left it like that for a long, long time.
Yeah. That's appropriate though. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for
He didn't really know the whole story till he read my book that I published about, I think that was 2019 or 2020.
Yeah. Here's what I can tell you, and do not start Googling me. Okay. Because then you'll find it all out.
Right.
Yeah. So this new book, I know the first book, it certainly was about that what we just talked about, but this new book there's some of that in there, but there's more authors than you, and there are lots of chapters that not only will it speak to the survivor, the homicide, suicide survivor, it also speaks to us, as investigators, as to how things are done and why things are done, and some good practices. And some of the chapters, of course, you've got the organizing your support community, facing the media, things like that. So kind of how does this book lay out, and what's the purpose of it, I guess? And some of the other authors, what do they contribute and things like that?
Well, then and now, the resources that are available to homicide survivors, and there aren't many, but it's very fractured, very difficult to pull them together, because help agents seldom speak to one another, so that for example, crime scene cleanup crew isn't going to be talking to the media. The media isn't going to be talking much to detectives, and it goes on and on that way. So you're left as a survivor to try to knit this all together, and you don't have the energy or the know-how to do it. So I set out to write a reference book that was organized longitudinally, starting out with the death notification. Now, that won't apply in all situations, because in some situations you witness the death. But I wanted to start someplace, and so I thought the death notification made sense as chapter 1, then facing the media. Because if I had that to do it over again, oh my God, if I knew then what I knew now, I would have handled the media so different. But I didn't know. Right. And all the options that survivors have, and then their first contacts with detectives, and why detectives do what they do. To us survivors, we don't understand. We get our cues from CSI and Law and Order.
Oh, yes.
So the fact that you don't have just our case is amazing to us. I mean, that sounds crazy, but you look at those shows, they work night and day on one case.
Yes.
They don't understand how cold cases become cold. They don't understand why they are sometimes suspected of the homicide. They don't understand the questions that you raise and why you won't give details, et cetera, et cetera. So in writing that chapter, I wanted to convey to homicide survivors and suicide survivors why, and the fact that even suicides are investigated as homicides, why that happens, why we are questioned the way we are, what the procedures are, and the importance of not pushing it. If they tell you they can't tell you, they can't tell you. Yeah. So I wanted to bring that dimension in. I wanted to bring in the physical dimension so that healthcare providers could know more about our health conditions. There's a whole chapter on funeral planning because that's another mystery. So I wanted to organize it longitudinally up to the trial and probation and eventually advocacy. I wanted to jam it full of resources, books, websites, people, and that's where other people came in, because since I've been on your show, I have my own podcast. And as you probably know from your work as a host on a podcast, you meet a network of people. Yeah. They're amazing, and they're from all over the world. And I found that I developed this very rich network of not only homicide survivors, but helpers involved on the periphery of homicide, like detectives, like crime scene cleanup crews, like funeral directors. I found one that had a murder in her family. And I wanted to pull all that information together in one book, if I possibly could, and quote them for it. And I had amazing cooperation. Here's just one example. I called this well-to-do or well-known defense attorney in Chicago, and I wanted to go over the chapter that I was then writing on what to do if you suspect you're being wrongly accused of the murder of your loved one. And I said, I'm not an attorney. Can I just please read you the list of 19 things to do if you suspect you're wrongly being accused of the death of your loved one? I want to make sure it's accurate because I'm not an attorney. And he goes, sure, okay. So he didn't charge me a penny. And I said, can I use your name? He goes, sure, I don't care. That's how everybody was. I had another person I contacted, a construction person, to talk about probate and how you keep the house together and I called a homicide detective I know. And I said, what do you do in the situation where you are a good friend of the deceased? You're not a relative. Your name is not on the house or on the lease, and they're murdered. And now you know that there's something inside that needs an emergency. Maybe the stove has been left on. Maybe there's a dog inside. Are you going to be charged with trespassing if you break in to fix that? What do you do? And he gave me some good examples of what you can do and not do in that situation to both help the situation without being accused of trespassing or theft or anything else. Yeah. So I got unprecedented help from, I think it was 17 or 18 different people, which I really appreciated because I'm not an expert in all this stuff. And I wanted it to be as deep as I could. And I also wrote it in such a way that you could skip chapters if it wasn't relevant to you. So there, for example, there's a chapter on grief in children. And if you don't have children, then that's not relevant. But certain points I've duplicated in certain chapters because I don't want it missed if you do skip chapters. Yeah. With an extensive glossary and places to go for further information. And I kept paring it down, and it still ended up to be longer than I would have liked.
476 pages, actually.
Yeah. And I had somebody tell me I wrote the Bible. That wasn't what I set out to do. No. But I wanted it to be comprehensive. And there's so much to it that I had no idea in the beginning. I had no idea even when I talked to you the last time. Yes. But as things evolve and you learn, there is just so many aftershocks that you have to address.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that I'm considering, this is such a good resource. So in my county, I'm the elected coroner. The last time I talked to you, I wasn't the elected coroner. I was a deputy coroner. Now I'm the boss, by the way. So anyway.
You're still in Missouri?
Still in Missouri, yep. And so I still teach all over the country too and stuff. But anyway, we're in the process of building a new morgue, a new facility and all that as well. And with part of that, that's where I get to here, is we are forming a Survivor Support Group, and that's the name of it, Survivor Support Group. And we're probably going to have 6 individuals that I'm kind of mirroring this off some others around the country that I have spoke to about how they're doing it, and they will be involved on some cases, and they'll go with the investigator. Some cases they won't go with the investigator. But if we have to, we're going to offer support on the scene and in resources, and then kind of follow them through answering questions over the next few weeks or months. And I'm thinking that a book like this, not only is it going to help me and my support teams to understand some of these things, because some of them are support volunteers. At this point, it's a volunteer program. They're not. We'll have training, we'll have organization, and it's going to be very well ran. But this is going to be a training aid for them as well. But I also think it's going to be something that if we have a homicide or suicide, that survivor family should have a copy of this book.
That would be a dream come true for me, because if somebody had handed me that, I could have avoided a lot of mistakes that I made, like dealing with the media. And I mean, it turned into a circus, and I still have regrets over how that was handled, but I didn't know.
All right, right. And, we have a small informational booklet that we give, like why is the coroner involved, if my loved one has to have an autopsy, why, and if it's a hospice, or it's a little bit of common questions. And so we give that to survivors of all death. We just give it to the next of kin. Some of them read it, some of them don't. Sometimes, and I tell them, is that I've answered all the questions you have today, but inevitably tomorrow you're going to have new questions, or you're going to have forgot what we talked about, because there's we're in a lot of trauma right now. I'm trying to answer your question, but you might not remember. So it might be in this book. If you don't find your answer in this little booklet, then call our office and we'll be glad to help you. And we've had people come back and say, it has really helped, because they forgot about how do I make arrangements to get the property, or is my husband going to, well, we've already answered it, but now it's in the book as well. So we now know that giving someone a resource in their hand that they can look to the chapters or to the topics that they want is helpful. And that's really what you've done in this book. So whether it be from the coroner and MEI investigators like us, or for the family, and like you said, you can skip a chapter if you just want to look at, I'm getting hounded by the press. What do I do? And there's a book right there that talks about, or a chapter that talks about the press.
Right.
And then if I'm getting ready to go to trial, I'm going to face a lot of stuff. The prosecutor, what's the defense attorney is going to do to me? What do I have to expect? You can go to your chapter about that, and that's going to give, I feel anyway, some, a little bit of comfort to them. Like, okay, I know a little bit now about the roadmap. It might not be the same roadmap, but it's very close to how this process is going to work.
And in theory, that's what victim advocates are supposed to do, but they're so few in number, they're overwhelmed, and they're not always available. I for reasons that I don't even understand, but I've had many homicide survivors tell me they never met with a victim advocate. Where that fell through the cracks, I don't know. They weren't around when it was my turn to need one.
Yeah. But some places don't have them.
That's true.
And if they do have them, a lot of times they've got defined roles, like they're working with child sexual assault cases, or they're working with, and so, it's not always, they're just not always available, and not every place has them. And that's the problem. And that's why we are starting this survivor support group for our office, because even though we have victim advocacies in our county, number one, they're only going to work with victims of crime, not suicide or car accident or 36-year-old heart attack, right? So they don't have any support. And then even the victims of crime, there's only 1 or 2 people working that office, and they can't get around. So our office is going to act like a liaison to them, and we can prod the other side along a little bit and say, hey, our mom here needs some help. Our mom here needs some questions. She can't get a hold of you guys. And our support team is going to act as that liaison to get them connected. That's kind of our thoughts on some of that stuff.
Right. That's one of the reasons I wrote that chapter on friends too, because I think it's chapter 2 or 3. It's because friends want to help. They're one step removed from the whole mess, but they don't know what to do. And we're so overwhelmed. We don't even know what to ask for. And there is so much they can do. And that's why I really, really wanted to go in depth in that chapter. But here's a laundry list of things that you as a friend can really do to help in the early hours, especially to keep them safe, to monitor their health reactions, to think about things that they're not thinking about, like safety, because sometimes there's revenge on the family. The perpetrators come back and they're not thinking about that. They're thinking, oh my God, I lost my brother to homicide, but they're not thinking about the fact that their doors are unlocked, the dog's in the backyard, and the car sitting in the driveway unlocked. There's so many things to think about, and you're not in a position to do that. So if we all get on board and pull it together, I think that they could be much more supported. And it, in the end, would not only help the survivor cope, but then they can be a better worker. They can be a better parent because they're functioning higher than if they were just left to muddle through.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about this is it's a 476-page book full of resources and information, and you've got it priced extremely low. I mean, Amazon, you got it priced extremely low. I mean, Amazon is selling the book for $19. That's very inexpensive.
Right.
You know,
I wanted to make it available.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's even less on Kindle.
Yeah. Kindle's like $4 and something on Kindle, and so that's the point. Is that I hope you make $1 million off it. The point is, it's that $20. Everybody has access to that.
Right.
That's something that you were not writing a resource that is this good, and we're putting a $69, $79 price tag on it, and then that limits who can use it.
Exactly.
So I
would also
admire that.
Thank you. I would also like it to be adopted as a course book, or at least an ancillary text for classes like in sociology or victimology, psychology, social work, because those are the people that are going to be going out to these fields. To my knowledge, there isn't a book like it out there. There are a few. There's one called What to Do When the Police Leave. It's about 100 pages or something. So there's a lot that it skips over. And again, I wanted to go in depth in case people need it. And I tried to write it as clearly as I could in like a 12th grade education level, so people had access to it. That's why there's an extensive glossary if people don't remember what, the term second-degree murder, how that differs from first-degree murder. You can go to the back and look it up. Yeah. Or what a plea bargain is, because there's so much information that we have to absorb. The learning curve as a survivor is humongous, and we're not in any position to be a good student at that point.
No, you're not. And by having a resource that you can look at today, and again tomorrow, and again next week, and again next month, because you got to keep reminding yourself of these things because because of the trauma. And this book also helps, even if we're talking about how it is titled, get it exactly right. What Now? Navigating the Aftermath of Homicide and Suicide. That's the title of the book. But I can see where this can also help those. My husband just had a heart attack and I'm all alone. I mean, there's some there. I mean, there's some information there as well. You're not going to have the press on you. You're not going to have a lot of that, but there's still some things to navigate.
And there's a lot of material on grief and the importance of support and so forth.
I mean, there's some
physical reactions.
Yeah, I mean, it's meant for the violent crime, and that is great at that. But there is some help in there for car accident. My son got killed in a car wreck, or something like that. I mean, when you're dealing with some other stuff, so that is also helpful. Do you have any agencies now? You mentioned you would like for it to be a text at some point in a course, so maybe that's not being done yet. Do you know of any other agencies or groups that's promoting your book or using it in a course platform? Because this is a new book. This is just over a month.
It just came out, right?
It just came out.
So yeah, I haven't.
Right.
I have a speaking engagement coming up at the end of June to the Pacific Northwest Identification Association. I'll be talking about it there a little bit, but no, I'm hoping organizations like NOVA will pick it up, or VSS, the Victim Support Services Network. But that remains to be seen.
Right.
I have somebody working on that. I'm not good at self-promotion. I'm not good at advertising, and that's not my bailiwick. Yeah. I have somebody who's putting that together right now. What's holding it up is I've redone the cover for my first book, and she wants to have everything all done before she really launches it.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. So, we're coming up on our time, Jan. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us. So in the show notes, there's going to be, for our listeners, there's going to be a little bit about the book. There's going to be some links there for them to get the book. Do you have a website proper to promote this?
Yes.
What is
And that has just been redone too. I've tried to put everything in one spot. And so I'm not on Instagram and all these things, but if you go to the website, you'll find everything, which is www.jancantyphd.com.
Okay.
And, we've just finished that yesterday, the revamping of it. I think it now works on tablets and phones, but I know it works on computers, but that's just brand new as of yesterday. Yeah. So the revamping of it. But I think if you went to that, you could find information as well as contact information for me.
Perfect. Well, and
I did send one to a couple of the school administrators where they've had mass killings. I haven't heard back yet, but that was just last week. Yeah, no, I think again, you're just over a month of release. And so as a time this comes out when we're talking, it's been just over a month. By the time this episode airs, it's probably going to be sometime late to mid-May, and so of 2023. So maybe you'll have a good 2 months in at that point. But still, at time that goes live, it's still going to be fairly new. You've got 60-day book here, so I think you'll see a lot of agencies, a lot of organizations pick this book up. I look forward to that, and I think that's going to happen. So, well, thank you for having me. That will help. Yeah, no, it was a fan. Well, one, I wanted to see you again because it's been a long time, and I've kind of keeping up with you some. So I love seeing you again. Very lovely lady. And then I wanted to make sure our listeners knew about this book because I knew you were working on it. And when it finally came out, I wanted to make sure that our listeners that knew the resources available. So Jan, again, thank you so much for everything. If if something comes up, you want to come back on the show, talk about an edition, talk about something else, please certainly let me know. Okay, I will. All right, thank you so much for having me back. Good talking to you. Yeah, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye. All right, I'm coming right back to you here. So, amazing. You agree with me? Amazing. Number one, Jan has an amazing story that I am so sorry she had to go through that. I would not wish that on anyone. But she has obviously over the years helped a lot of people with her story. And now this book, again, is a resource to help a lot of people. And so you can find it in the show notes, a little bit of description about the book, plus a link to actually go to Amazon and purchase the book for yourself. It makes me no money. I'm not here for that. And in fact, like we talked about, it's cheap. It's like $19, a huge, thick book, a lot of resources for $19. Jan is not in this trying to make money from this. She literally is pouring her heart in to help survivors because she knows what she went through and she's trying to help others. And I commend that, and I think it's fantastic. So go to her website, Jan Canty, Canty, jancantyphd.com. Check out not only the book, but there's some videos on there. You can find her podcast. There's some other resources on there that, and she would love to hear from you. She would love to go to contact page on her website and type in, a short message to her that you heard her on the podcast and just say hi. And if you have any questions, I'm sure she'd be willing to jump in and help you with that as well. So without any further delay, I'm going to let you go today. I want to, again, thank you for sticking through this whole time. Remember, find a way to be a blessing to someone in your life or in your community. It will pay you back tenfold. And above all, I want you back. So be safe.
Thanks for listening to Coroner Talk, a DSPN media production.
Visit our website at coronertalk.com.
And be sure to like us on Facebook at facebook.com/coroner training.
3617 1024 scene en route to morgue.